Hello, I'm 𝗪𝗁𝗆, founder of Starlit Contracts, where we help you to negotiate and use contracts with confidence. This video is part of our Build the Foundation in Contracts program, and our topic is variations and change orders. Let's look at this topic in summary now, and firstly, what is it? Well, essentially we're talking about amendments to the contract. So two parties to the contract entered into negotiations, they signed a form of contract, they might even be performing that contract now, and then one or the other party to it wants to amend that contract in some way. How does it work in practice? Well, contracts will often set out a methodology for parties to follow in case they want to make an amendment to the contract. Is this something that you should care about? Well, it really depends on your contract. Is there any possibility that it might need to be amended at some point? If so, it is helpful to have a methodology that describes what you need to do in case of amendments before there's an obligation for one of the parties to start to perform that amendment. Let's look at a practical example together now. Television Supply Limited enters into a contract with customer to supply 1,000 televisions. Customer wants to connect audio equipment to the televisions for resale to consumers and requests that supplier provide the audio equipment too. What could go right for the supplier in this situation? Well, upon receiving that request, the supplier might think, well, I do supply televisions, but I don't have within my portfolio the audio equipment that would connect with those televisions. So the supplier can reflect on this and decide, do I want to potentially work with a third party, a subcontractor, in order to purchase that audio equipment and supply it to the customer, or would I rather not because for whatever reason I don't feel comfortable to do it, or I'm not confident that I would make sufficient profit to justify taking that action. If the supplier decides against it, it can just inform the customer of that decision and there's no obligation on the supplier to amend the contract. What could go wrong for the supplier in this situation? Well, it might be that the supplier and the customer agreed in the contract that the customer is able to instruct or to mandate amendments to the contract when that amendment relates to the original scope of work. So it could be in this situation that the customer says, supplier, you might not want to provide me with a quote for this, however, the audio equipment is related to the original scope of work, the television, so you are required to provide me with that quote. This would mean that the supplier is essentially under an obligation to provide this quote, even when they would prefer not to. Let's look at a sample clause and some key considerations together now, and firstly to the clause. Either party may request an amendment to the agreement. Request must be in writing and in sufficient detail for the other party to evaluate the potential impact. If the request is acceptable in principle to the other party, then the parties will use their reasonable and commercially prudent efforts to amend the agreement. A first point to consider is whether the right to request an amendment to the contract should be one-way or two-way. If it's one way, that would typically mean that it's only the customer who has the right to request, to instruct, or even to mandate amendments to that contract. If it's two-way, then that would typically mean that both the customer and the supplier have the ability to request those amendments to the contract. Now let's look at the underlined wording in this sample clause, which requires the parties to use their reasonable but commercially prudent efforts to amend the contract. The idea here is that both parties are able to keep in mind their commercial positions when they're looking to make such an amendment to the contract. So in other words, it's not putting one of the parties to a commercial disadvantage by amending the contract when maybe they'll just prefer to stick with the original contract. Now these words can be changed with words such as the use of all reasonable efforts or best efforts, or even to say use of endeavours. Now depending on the law that governs the contract, this can result in an escalation of the obligation for the parties to enter into that amendment, potentially with less reference to their commercial position. And the sample clause continues, neither party is obliged to perform an amendment unless and until both parties sign the amendment to the contract in writing. The purpose of this clause is to try and avoid disagreements between the parties later on, because if there's a verbal agreement, something which is not supported in writing, and the parties subsequently have some sort of dispute or misalignment, then the issue with a verbal agreement is it's just the word of one party against the other party. So whenever possible, try and ensure that any amendment to the contract is recorded in writing clearly before the obligation to implement that amendment is engaged. I hope that this introductory content is helpful for you, but if you're ready to use a law firm or to hire a lawyer, then go to our website starlitcontracts.com, where we will help you to find the lawyer that you need to address your requirements. See you there.